Hello everyone, this is week 11 and this week we're looking at safe and affordable housing. Again, one of those topics that is connected to the built environment and is really quite key as we look at determinants of health in terms of if I live in quality housing, my life is probably better, my health is probably better than people who are living in substandard homes. Just of interest, I've captured 3 slides. This is a typical farm scene of a really nice historical home on a farm in Huron County. But I've also went to MLS listings from real estate agents to look at what's available at the lower end of that price range. And you can see a home here at $99,000, and this would be in Mobile Home Park at $59,000. So you get within rural communities this incredible range of housing that can be available, and some is quite good, but we also have economic circumstances in other areas that lead to the homes not being so good. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail this week. As part of this week, there's of course videos and readings and assignments. Remember that assignment 4 is actually due this week, and assignment 5 is due next week. And next week we will come together as a group for an in-class discussion related to assignment 5, your final assignment. We'll look at housing issues in rural communities, and we'll look at relationships between housing and healthy rural and small town communities as well. Again, just some diversity of housing along the bottom captured here of interest. This is actually from a Hutterite colony in Saskatchewan, or actually, I'm sorry, Manitoba, where there are many families come together in a communal context. Again, a certain kind of housing, a traditional farmhouse. Actually, that's the house I was raised in. And this is an example of a really tiny house in Wales, actually, I think is where I experienced that. So anyway, different kinds of housing, and it's worth our while to keep in mind the diversity that exists, and in some cases, the need for more diversity. I want to give a little bit of discussion really related to next week with assignment 5. It will be an in-class facilitated discussion, 3 that I'll facilitate, 3 key questions. What topic did you focus on? Or what were some of your key findings? Please share key aspects of your innovative example. As part of assignment 5, you're doing essentially a mini paper, but also capturing an innovative example. And by innovative, I mean it might be innovative, might be simply something that's done really well in a community that you've looked at. You prepare one pager on, similar to what's included in the toolkit itself. And while a formal presentation isn't required, in fact, we won't be doing a formal presentation. I'll bounce around and ask people their perspectives on things. I do encourage you to come with a 1 or 2 page slide deck, essentially 1 or 2 items capturing your innovative example, because I think that will be of interest to the rest of your classmates. So any questions on assignment 5, send me an email. Videos this week, the video accompanying this slide deck, a really short video with Liz Buckton, 1 or 2 minutes long, just some social housing partnerships she's been involved with. And again, George Gibbon has been kind enough to contribute to the class by his experience and his perspectives on housing. The readings, and again, being at the end of the semester, we've reduced them somewhat. The slide deck itself, and have a look at this report, Affordable Housing in Rural Ontario. There's a web link for you included in the course link, and reduce it again by identifying some specific pages that you might look to from a reading perspective. So as we look at housing and social determinants of health, and this takes back again to a reading from week 2, and it's just interesting to, and I'll just read this statement here. Many studies show that poor quality housing and homelessness are clear threats to the health of Canadians. Housing is an absolute necessity for living a healthy life, and living in unsafe, unaffordable, or insecure housing increases the risk of many health problems. Lack of economic resources is the prime reason many Canadians experience housing problems. So that notion of economy tied to housing is not surprising, but it just points to the importance of looking at poverty issues parallel with housing issues as well. So housing impacts on health, a number of key points identified here. And again, this takes us to that reading from week 2, Social Determinants of Health. The presence of lead and mold, poor heating and draft inadequate ventilation, vermin, and overcrowding are all determinants of adverse health outcomes. I don't think that would surprise us, but it's to acknowledge that that is the case. Secondly, some homes, especially in Aboriginal reserves, lack clean water and basic sanitation. and to underline the issue for Aboriginal communities. But also within rural communities, I've experienced situations where there's inadequate septic systems that don't work all that well. And you can imagine in a community or where private services are provided, such as water and septic tank, that if the septic system fails, many people might try to live with it as opposed to repair it if it's going to cost them $15,000 or $20,000 to do so. High housing costs reduces resources for other essentials, which is to say if you're forced to pay a certain amount for housing, it means that you've got less available for other things in life, such as food and other necessities. Also to bring focus to the impact on children if they're in low quality housing, have a greater likelihood of poor health outcomes, both as children and as they mature into adults as well. Respiratory issues with dampness, for example, have been flagged as key examples of that. And it's hard to separate the effects of housing from other factors, and we've talked about this already, such as poverty, poor housing, and pre-existing illness all tend to come together. But there have been studies that have separated out the housing component of it, demonstrating that yes, insufficient or inadequate housing, poor housing conditions can be an independent cause of adverse health outcomes. So we often look at the literature and see how urban focused it might be. Try to draw out some of the rural perspectives on housing as they exist here. Compared to urban communities, many rural communities experience lower incomes, right? And we know that from previous work. As mentioned just a moment ago, reliant on private services. Certainly in the countryside, it's going to be almost certainly will be private well and private septic system. In many small hamlets, it's also private wells and private septic systems. And you can appreciate the risk for contamination that can exist in those environments. Rural communities have an older housing stock. About 29% of the housing stock in rural Canada was built before 1941. And some of those older homes are nice, they were well built, but they would be lacking things such as proper insulation probably, and no doubt there could be other issues with ventilation and so on that can be problematic. Affordable homes in rural communities, you think of a home as being affordable. It may be affordable because it requires major repairs, and those repairs have not occurred. There's a little picture here of a mobile home as an example, which reflects some of the diversity in housing stock that may not exist. Less choice, fewer apartments in many rural communities compared to an urban context. And of course, limited social housing will often be the case in rural communities as well. Other issues in rural communities, older populations with specific needs. Are homes air conditioned? Are they not? Are they accessible? Are they not? Are there homes for the aged, which might be required? Here we have a picture of a couple homes for the aged. And I actually had an opportunity to, in an interim capacity with the County of Huron, serve as the administrator for the home for the aged in the county for a year while they went through some management reviews. And you just come away with an appreciation for what the elder population requires and what they might not always have in their homes relative to modern facilities such as these. The dilemma in many rural communities is that these are really limited in terms of their availability and there's strong demand for them. Significantly influenced by proximity to major urban areas and whether there has been a recent growth or decline. So if you have a home in a rural community, but that community is within the commuter shed of an urban center, you may be limited in your ability to afford what might be inflated home prices because of that proximity. Numerous factors can influence supply and demand, and some of these are under the control of municipalities such as land supply and availability, but other issues such as the developer's willingness to build or not build might be outside of the demand or outside of the purview of municipalities to control. And we should also recognize that many rural people can live in relatively isolated situations without any transit to assist them. So again, if you're living in poor or poverty conditions, your home may be impacted, your ability to have transportation for better paying jobs may be significantly limited. I had a study completed by a student a few years ago looking at Northern Ontario, and particularly the trap that often occurred for two-person households or family, a couple where traditionally the man would be working and they would be able to afford one vehicle, the vehicle would be gone, and then for someone to have a second vehicle to drive some distance to work at Tim Hortons, it's simply not viable to do so. So these issues tend to all mix together in a complicated kind of way. Limited investment in rural housing by private developers, which is to say if you're a developer and you can build in an urban context where there's lots of demand, you're probably going to build there as opposed to taking a risk in a smaller community where you might sell 2 or 3 homes a year. Another lengthy statement in some ways, but perhaps worth reflecting on. Housing choices in rural areas, I have to keep looking at my screen here, in rural areas are mostly limited to single-family homes, low apartment buildings, semi-detached homes, and on occasion secondary suites and mobile homes. In most communities, there is a lack of existing rental housing and construction, which in turn contributes to low vacancy rates, poor conditions of existing units, and high operating costs. Housing tenure is generally limited to home ownership, requiring significant efforts of low-income households to save for down payment or a mortgage. All of which is to summarize to say there are issues with affordability, there's issues with availability, and for people that might be trapped with a low income, it becomes all that much more difficult for those reasons. So as we look at rural housing, one might traditionally think that there's an advantage to living in a rural community. And it speaks here to one comparative, and this is coming from the assigned reading this week, the one comparative advantage of living in rural areas for rural poor is cheap housing. To a degree, the cheaper housing reflects the fact that housing stock is older and more likely to be dilapidated. The rural poor are much more likely to live in mobile homes than are their urban counterparts. So again, if you live in a rural context with limited income, your choices are limited, your ability to afford those choices are limited, which means that poor quality housing tends to be used and mobile homes become a potential outcome of that. This slide is looking at homelessness in rural communities, and I won't read this. It's simply to say that in rural communities, homelessness tends to be invisible, or much more invisible than would be the context in an urban situation. People will couch surf, or they will live in poor quality housing, and it would be, as mentioned at the very last paragraph, it speaks to the fact that that particularly populations that are particularly vulnerable to homelessness include victims of domestic violence, the unemployed, and entire families rather than single individual households. Again, noting that there are some important differences in rural compared to urban, and the housing sector reflects that. I'm not going to go through this in detail, simply to indicate, again, this is coming from the required reading, which is Under Pressure, Affordable Housing in Rural Ontario. There's a number of indicators which the author has flagged as being key aspects that we would want to look at in more detail to understand what's really happening in the rural community within which you might be living or working. So indicators such as what is the type of housing that's available, what's the tenure of that housing, rental versus ownership as an example, condition, and there's some really interesting results comparing rural to urban in terms of condition based on the age of the housing. What's the rental cost? Is it affordable or not? What is the core housing need of the community itself? Is there enough availability to support a rental need as an example? What's the need from an ownership perspective? What are the values of homes? Because the values of homes, and we saw a couple of examples from the very first slide that seem affordable, are they or are they not relative to the community as a whole? What's the economy doing, and what are the income levels within the community? Because I think all of those indicators play a really helpful role in helping us to understand what's actually happening within the community. Barriers, and this again coming from the same source, there's an entire chart here of which I'm simply going to focus on this one line here, which speaks to the second quadrant. Stable or slow growth communities, which is many of the communities that would be captured by a no growth situation. Because that has some specific implications in terms of what will be happening there relative to a growing community. So NIMBYism might be an issue, not in my backyard, people opposed to change. Limited land for development can often be the cause there. Economic uncertainty in these communities of limited growth. Poor social conditions may be present. Certainly may be a lack of a viable housing market. Again, it comes back to the development sector. Are they going to build new homes, rental or otherwise, if the market and the economy is in flux? The need for community services, are they present or not? And what are the social assistance needs that might be part of that community as well? There's a number of opportunities that are identified for communities in that context, and I invite you to look at the results both for this sector of homes, but also growing communities or declining communities or resort communities and so on. And all the way from the supply of affordable land can be influenced by municipalities through to manufactured homes, which are a means by which you can put quality homes on the market at a somewhat lesser cost. So a variety of options there in terms of opportunities that, again, invite you to read that in a little bit more detail. There are a number of policy recommendations for municipalities, again coming from the that same document that's our assigned reading for the week. And these include looking at official plans. Do they permit secondary garden suites, as an example, which is a way of providing somewhat more affordable homes. A garden suite is an outbuilding, sometimes referred to as a granny flat, but is an ability to have a second unit on the property. Also, it's suggested here to look at property assembly through land trusts. I think that's an interesting point to think about further. The key point there is this notion of property assembly, and I've worked with communities which simply didn't have adequate acreages of land available to pursue and proceed with the development, which is to say it was fractured in small, tiny acreages, which is really hard to have a concerted development proceed. Work with the Ministry of Environment to look at standards related to the intensification in the context of maintaining public water safety. Health units have an important role in that as well, as do municipalities. It's a key component, but let's make sure that the standards which are being applied are properly understood and appropriate in the community context. Intensification in existing hamlets and villages is a way of putting housing on the market in a more affordable way. And it's also a means of providing services in a more affordable way, notwithstanding that you need to respect the differences that people will be hoping to or aspiring to within a community. And consider affordable housing as a component of an economic development strategy. Interestingly, in another class, I've got a request from a community that wants us as a group project to look at housing availability because there simply isn't any rental housing on the market. And because of that, they can't attract employment. So they can't attract people to work in businesses or industries, and there's a lack of employees to fulfill the needs of that community. Some other strategies to consider: housing conversions, retrofits, and intensifications. Are there the opportunities to take an existing large home and create more than one unit within it in a way of creating additional housing at a relatively low cost? Partnerships with social service agencies and nonprofits. I find it quite amazing the amount of work that is being done by church groups who might be running or operating homes for retirees, or other groups within society, within the community that might have an interest in providing housing, particularly for the elderly. Maintain existing built facilities that can be adapted to housing. Secondary suites in existing homes are an example as well. I'm aware of a community that's taken a former school that was abandoned and converted it into, not abandoned, but it lost its uses as a school and then was converted to housing. Again, a chance to use existing facilities. Become aware of the housing studies. These have been completed pretty much across the province by counties and regions. There's an example provided here, and this is really the strategy that's developed by municipalities to deal with housing issues within their community, and planning departments deal with that work quite frequently. Work with motivated individuals and agencies to construct model projects, and that's tied to the partnership issue, but there are things that can be done to demonstrate opportunities that people will then, it's the old innovation diffusion modeling of something innovative happens and other people will start to copy it. Community forums to encourage networking, bring people together is essentially what that's about. And use legislative tools such as the building code, health standards to ensure safe living conditions. Because again, there are many homes that they may not have smoke detectors, and fire departments, for example, are really invested in making sure that happens in an urban context. Is it happening in a rural context? What can be done to enhance insulation within homes? Because if you don't have proper insulation, you're simply giving money up to the environment in terms of increased heating bills and so on. So looking at that sector and that component of the housing market is an important thing to do as well. So with that, that concludes our looking at housing this week. And next week, our final class is an in-class discussion related to your final assignment. And as mentioned earlier, there's some guidelines both within the course outline and online, and earlier within this video in terms of what's expected next week. So have a good week, and we'll see you next week.